Welcome to the National Evaluation System for Health Technology webinar on real-world evidence for medical devices. And we're looking at lessons learned from our NEST test cases or pilots, which is what the interim report on the independent assessment conducted by RAND, that's what it was based upon, which was part of our Medical Device User Fee Act or MDUFA IV commitment. My name is Sandy Siami and I head NEST, and I'm thrilled that you are here with us today. Next slide. Our agenda during this hour will cover a brief presentation. I'll set the stage right now. But then we'll hand it over to Justin Timby from the RAND Corporation, and he was the lead analysis of a team of colleagues that did this interim independent assessment, and his presentation will summarize the highlights of that. And then after Justin's presentation, we're going to move into a panel discussion to discuss the interim findings, how NEST might play a role in developing these solutions to the challenges or findings, or finding even efficiencies specifically for medical devices as we continue to add capabilities to the system. On the panel, we'll have representatives from our NEST governing committee, submitting organizations, as we call them, to those test cases, which is mainly industry and medical device manufacturers, as well as network collaborators who participated and executed these test cases. So getting a range of perspectives here. There will be also time at the end of the webinar and the panel session for audience Q&A. So if you have any questions, please type them in the Zoom Q&A box. It's located on the bottom of your screen. And with that, let's get started. Next slide. So setting the stage, hopefully many of you know real-world evidence was identified as a priority as a part of the process improvements for under MDUFA IV, right? And that's when NEST was established. And under this commitment, NEST was charged with implementing pilots, or we call them test cases, for at least one product code in each of the regulatory pathways. And this includes the pre-market approval pathway or PMA pathway, or the pre-market notification or 510K process. To meet this commitment, we executed 21 test cases covering a variety of therapeutic areas and product codes, different classes of devices, different regulatory pathways. These pilots were really focused on determining the feasibility or usability of real-world evidence for expanding things like label expansions, new clearances or approvals, or even improved malfunction reporting. At the conclusion of these pilots, an independent third party, in this case, the RAND Corporation, would conduct an assessment to evaluate the strengths, the limitations, and appropriate use of real-world evidence for informing pre-market decision-making for multiple types of devices. It would be through this mechanism that we would then help identify areas where NEST could play a role in creating efficiencies or addressing challenges. But because there was such heightened interest, which is a good thing, about this independent assessment by all of our stakeholders, such as yourselves who are attending this webinar, and these stakeholders, all of you are so passionate and committed that we did ask RAND to provide and issue an interim report by December of 2021. That's when the interim report was released, with the final report that includes all of the test cases to be issued at the end of our MDUFA IV commitment period, which is September of 2022. So next slide. Now that I've set the stage, I am very pleased to introduce Justin Timby, if he could also come on camera. He is the Senior Health Policy Researcher at the RAND Corporation. Justin's research focuses on value-based payment, healthcare organizational models and their effects on provider and patients, and health policy issues involving the safety net. Again, he was our lead researcher for this NEST effort, and we greatly appreciate his presentation today. So with that, Justin, let me hand it over to you.
Well, thanks, Sandy. It's good to be with you all today, and thanks for the invitation to deliver this presentation. So for today, as Sandy indicated, we're here to share some of the key findings from our ongoing work conducting the assessment of the NEST test cases. And the goal is really to identify and document lessons learned from the test cases. And as Sandy indicated, the presentation today will focus on just the first 14 test cases that were included in our interim report from December of 2021. So next slide. Great, so those first 14 test cases were those that were completed through August 2021, and they covered a wide range of devices, in vitro diagnostic tests, and very specific and diverse research questions. And we can't really get into all of those details and diversity on this webinar, but I refer attendees to our report, which is available on NEST's website. And the goals of the assessment were threefold. First, to synthesize key lessons on the use of real-world data, and they're focusing on challenges accessing and extracting the real-world data for research purposes, but also looking at key lessons from the perspective of stakeholders, of the participants, to find out what really worked well in the test cases. Second, to gather stakeholder views on the strength of the evidence, really with an eye towards how to improve the evidence going forward, moving from sort of these pilot tests to studies for the purpose of generating evidence to support regulatory decisions. And then third, identifying ways to help stakeholders generate real-world evidence. So trying to identify very specific actions that stakeholders could take to facilitate research and evidence generation using real-world data. Next slide. Okay, so in terms of our approach, we conducted reviews of test case deliverables, which were study protocols and various reports, and we conducted interviews with participants. And so the interim report again focuses on the first 14 test cases. The remaining 7 will be complete and included in our final report in September of 2022. In terms of the interviews, we conducted interviews with 44 stakeholders, 31 network collaborators. And so these, as Sandy mentioned, were the organizations that had access to the real world data and the expertise to analyze the data, as well as 13 submitting organizations, typically medical device manufacturers, who responded to the call for research concepts and submitted very specific research questions that the network collaborators applied to the real world data. Next slide. So I'll start with some of the keys to success. And first, using data from manufacturers to identify the target population. So manufacturer provided data were really helpful for identifying the target population, as well as providing a gold standard against which the test case teams could use to validate their algorithms for identifying the target population. And so manufacturers sometimes provided detailed patient level data, sometimes more reduced data sets, dates of service, for example. The approach for data sharing differed across the test cases based on the preferences for all parties. Second key to success was the use of rich clinical data from registries to enhance the EHR data. And so various test cases used cardiac, orthopedic, or cancer registries. And these really provided a curated source of rich clinical data that may not otherwise be available or easily extractable from the EHRs for the network collaborators. And third was the use of common data models to standardize EHR data. And in particular, PCORNet and OMAP were common data models used in the test cases. And this meant that the network collaborators could use the same algorithm to query and extract data from their EHRs. And the PCORNet common data model in particular also had the added benefit there were built-in quality checks associated with those data marts that lessened the burden on the test cases, the network collaborators that used the PCORNet common data model in their test cases. And then the other key to success, and we heard this repeatedly, was the team that the test cases, that the network collaborators assembled for the test case. And so in particular, physician researchers who were really helpful in the design of the test cases in terms of selecting endpoints and defining how to measure those endpoints, as well as specifying the key information, the covariates that would be needed for these analyses. And then, of course, the data scientists played an equally important role. They had the knowledge of their data sets, the infrastructure in their site, knowledge about linking data sets together. And really, a lot of the workflows were repetitive and iterative in terms of developing these algorithms to identify the target population and measure endpoints. And that iterative nature of the work required close engagement by physician researchers and the data scientists. Next slide. There were a number of challenges, and we did hear frequently the same challenges arose in a lot of the test cases. So first, identifying use of specific devices when UDIs were not available. And it really was a priority for several test cases to identify use of a specific device. But UDIs were not consistently available in all health systems that were participating in the research or for certain service lines. And the specific time horizon around which UDI information might be available varied across sites within a test case. And so test case teams that relied on text searches for manufacturer names and device names really didn't fare all that well. UDIs were really important for this research. Second was extracting key data elements from unstructured EHR fields. And so specific elements related to medical devices, for example, implementation procedures and other data elements around the deployment of a device in a patient was important information which was hard to extract from EHRs. Other data elements, including cancer, radiology related information, was really hard to get out of EHRs in the test cases. Next box. Yep. So the other challenge was the granularity and reliability of diagnosis and procedure codes. And I think many researchers knew that this would be a challenge. So in the test cases, some of the specific challenges that arose were identifying mechanical devices, heart valve devices, as opposed to bioprosthetic valves, differentiating active diagnoses from histories of diagnoses, and certainly different sites within participating in the same test case often use different procedure codes for the same type of procedure. And so this really did require the network collaborators to go back and refine their algorithms and sometimes turn to manual data abstraction from EHRs to more accurately define diagnoses and procedures. Next box is, so the final challenge that I wanted to mention today was long-term follow-up of study endpoints. And so this was a challenge in many of the test cases, particularly those that wanted to look at endpoints after 30 days. And it was really a challenge for network collaborators that received a lot of patients via referral into their systems, and also for survival endpoints. Network collaborators that didn't have linkages to death indexes were in a more difficult position measuring survival endpoints over a long time period. But this was also, I think, something that researchers knew would be a challenge. And so several test cases made a deliberate attempt to study the completeness of follow-up in their test cases for endpoints at 30 days, 1 year, 2 years, and really trying to quantify the completeness to get a better handle on the long-term follow-up challenges. Next slide. Okay, so the test cases also identified several opportunities to improve use of real-world data. First, expanding UDI capture in hospitals and health system EHRs. And so the systematic capture of UDIs is really important as the research moves from sort of feasibility to evidence generation, because information on specific devices is going to be critical for those regulatory decisions. But in some of our conversations, we also heard the test case teams describe the value of this research and the availability of UDIs in their systems to support practice pattern research and to inform purchasing decisions in their health systems. So there's many benefits of being able to track use of specific devices. Developing libraries of computable phenotypes and endpoints. And by computable phenotypes, I mean algorithmic definitions of clinical conditions that rely on diagnosis codes and other data elements. And developing these computable phenotypes was an initial first step for many test cases in the NEST test case initiative. And it was often a time-consuming step building these computable phenotypes. And so there does appear to be a role for developing these curated libraries of computable phenotypes with information about validation studies in which the phenotypes were validated, and other information that can help researchers take some of these algorithms off the shelf and really get started on additional phases of the research and not spend a lot of time in the early stages developing these algorithms. And developing computable endpoint libraries would also have efficiency gains. It would potentially lessen the burden of adjudicating endpoints for the research teams. Expanding the use and breadth of common data models. So there's certainly opportunities to expand common data models to include more device information, more information on cancer related data elements, which were really hard to find and extract and use in analyses. And then the last opportunity would be to create more linkages between EHRs, registries, and claims. And these additional linkages could help address gaps in individual real-world data sets, as well as to improve follow-up over long time periods. And one of the test cases explored privacy preserving record linkage. And so that represents one opportunity to expand linkages in a privacy preserving way that may be useful going forward. And then in terms of the last, sorry, next slide, please. So it was our sense from speaking with over 44 different stakeholders after their test cases had completed that there was widespread view that the test cases did establish proof of concept. But as the research moves into sort of follow-on studies with the goal of generating evidence, there are a couple of priorities for research with real-world data. And those I've listed on the slide here. First, larger sample sizes. So some of the test cases did have challenges with sample sizes depending on their specific research question and the specific device and use case for the device. So the strategic selection of sites for this research will be really important going forward. Additional validation of endpoints. So the validation of endpoints wasn't a major priority for the test cases, but as so several of the test cases opted to validate endpoints on a relatively small sample of cases. But as this evidence is being used more and more for regulatory decision making, the scale of the validation activity will probably need to increase. More complete follow-up. So relatively few of the test cases pursued data linkages, given the timeline and the scope of the test cases. But expanding these data linkages, particularly with claims or other strategies like identifying patient cohorts that predominantly use care within a single closed system would be strategies to improve follow-up going forward. And then finally, greater alignment across sites. So in some cases, some test case teams used multiple common data models, which presented challenges with efficiency. And the other area where we saw differences across sites within a test case was in the manual data abstraction procedures. And so more alignment in the processes for data abstraction could help with efficiency going forward. And so just in terms of concluding thoughts, in nearly every interview that we conducted, stakeholders said that the test cases were a valuable learning experience. And those test case teams that proceeded on to additional research, additional follow-on studies, they cited the value of the test cases in surfacing the major issues, conducting research to examine their specific questions. And many of the challenges that arose in the test cases, they were really trying to address head-on in their phase 2 follow-on research. So I think with that, that's my last slide, including my remarks. So thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you, Justin, for setting the stage for our discussion by presenting the interim findings of this independent assessment. If we could just go to the next slide. And I will introduce our panelists as hopefully they are able to now come on video. And after I introduce the panelists, we'll let the slide go away so we can see each other's faces and be a little bit more conversational. Let me, without further ado, introduce our panelists. Paul Copeland, he is the Global Head of Medical Device Epidemiology and Real-World Data Sciences at Johnson & Johnson. He is also Adjunct Assistant Professor at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine. He has served as the submitting organization lead for a few of our NEST test cases. He also participates in our active surveillance methodology working group, and he is co-chair of our data quality subcommittee. So welcome, Paul. Next, we have Adrian Hernandez. He is a professor of medicine at Duke School of Medicine, and he is the Vice Dean and Executive Director of Duke Clinical Research Institute, or DCRI. He is the current chair of our NEST governing committee, and he has been a valuable advisor since the inception of NEST. So welcome, Adrian. Joe Ross is a professor of medicine and public health at Yale School of Medicine. He leads the efforts at Yale New Haven Health, Yale New Haven Health System as a NEST network collaborator. He has served as principal investigator for several of our test cases and also serves on our data quality subcommittee. Welcome, Joe. And we have Art Sadrakian. Art is a professor of population health sciences at Weill Cornell Medicine. He is also director for the Institute for Health Technologies and Interventions and heads the MD EpiNet Coordinating Center. He represents Weill Cornell, the Institution for Nutritional Sciences, Global Health and Technology, or INSIGHT Network, and MD EpiNet in our research network. He has served as principal investigator for several of our test cases, has previously served on the NEST governing committee, and he also currently serves as a member of our data quality subcommittee. So welcome, Art, and I will also ask Justin, who hopefully has rejoined us too, from RAND, to join the virtual stage. With that, I'd like the panelists to first open with a few brief remarks from your perspective as a valued stakeholder, and I'll just do it in the order of that I presented you. And then we'll go to some additional panel question discussions, but audience, please feel free if you have questions, put them in the Q&A box in Zoom, which is located on the bottom, hopefully on the bottom of your screen. So with that, Paul, let me turn to you and get your thoughts, initial thoughts from your perspective, from industry's perspective.
Thank you, Sandy. So as you mentioned, I was honored to be involved in 4 test cases where J&J proposed a concept, and that was funded by NEST, and we were able to complete all 4 test cases. We were completed in the first 2 test cases to get done, and we identified that there was feasibility to continue to look further at the research questions we had posed. So we actually got a second phase of funding from NEST to continue that work and actually go beyond the feasibility to delivering submissions to FDA or realizing where there were limitations that we couldn't go to a submission. And I think that what NEST did a fantastic job on is identifying the pressure points, the pain points in using real-world evidence across the medical device scenario, because medical devices are so diverse, there's so many different applications that what the test cases really did a great job on, and I think Justin's done a great job in summarizing in RAND, is identifying where those pain points are. And so the big question is, how do we go, now that we've identified those pain points with great clarity, how do we go to the next steps to solve those pain points? And I look forward to discussing that further today.
Thanks so much, Paul. Adrian, can I turn it over to you, or did you have to step away? You might have had to step away. I will skip Adrian for the moment. Joe.
Great, thanks, Sandy. Thanks for having me on the panel today. Yeah, no, this has been a remarkable journey, I would say, in terms of learning more around what our health systems can do to generate real-world evidence for medical device research. So at the Yale New Haven Health System, we participated in one round 1 test case, along with 5 round 2 test cases, along with a kind of ancillary work that we're doing on behalf of NEST to survey network providers. or collaborators. And our test cases have varied, which I think has offered a lot of unique insights. Some have used health system data to try to identify patient populations. Others have used health system data to identify users of medical devices. And one was a project that we're working on with Paul and Johnson & Johnson, looking at the safety and effectiveness of this device for a new clinical indication. But we're even doing 2 randomized controlled trials where we're generating real world evidence as part of pragmatic clinical trials for 2 digital software devices. So, really interesting, kind of pushing the boundaries of kind of what's happening or can be happening in real world evidence generation. And it's just been very exciting to be a part of it. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Joe. Art.
Sure. Thanks for invitation again, Sandy. I absolutely agree that the RAND report is very comprehensive, and I was really pleased to participate in 3 test cases and lead 3 others. We approach to real world evidence from multiple angles. We have looked at the registry data, EHR data, billing claims data. So we try to be as comprehensive as possible, leveraging the strengths of each type of data source. But we also invested quite a bit of time in developing metrics for technology like device assessments and also tools to collect patient-reported outcomes data. I think those components are not, they were not necessarily highlighted by Justin, but I'm sure like a really important part of the report as well as additional solutions and strategic areas for expansion and developmental work within NEST. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Art. Really appreciate that perspective. Adrian, last but not least.
All right. Sorry to step away. I had to answer the real world clinical service. And so it turns out the real world continues on. The way I would think about this is that, everyone has been really interested for lots of great reasons in terms of taking advantage of real world data for generating real world evidence. And the way I view these test cases is that with this ocean of data, these groups are Jacques Cousteau's. These are our leaders who are actually uncovering kind of what's the insights in this ocean of data. And so this, initial explorations and certainly help provide the proof of concept, but it's just a start in terms of so-called mapping the ocean floor of what's possible and also what's in the ocean of data that's accumulating every day across our different healthcare systems. So it's a beginning. And so if you think about, what we've seen already, that there's a huge opportunity, again, with this concept of an ocean of data for which we have to continuously map, learn, and iterate for generating real-world evidence that will be meaningful for different stakeholders as we go along. So an exciting start for all this. And I do appreciate all the groups that have joined as being pioneers here, those explorers. So it's not without heartburn, heartaches, and I'll just say occasional bumps and bruises as people are trying to break through new ground.
That's fantastic, and feeds in very nicely for the first kind of topic for feedback from this group. And again, I'd like to be conversational instead of me calling on folks to respond. And I know this group is not shy in providing feedback. So Justin did a fantastic job kind of presenting the high level findings, including challenges and what worked well and where we need to improve. But what are, from this group's perspective, from the panelists' perspective, what's the biggest opportunity for using real world evidence in medical devices, and what's the biggest challenge? And I frame this, and I'm going to throw a couple of audience questions in there too. For example, UDI. How quickly could we use UDI and have that accessible? And I know, Joe, you're doing some work in that area. likewise, how can we get that adoption more with registries? So that's just an example, kind of trying to weave in some audience questions, but let me pause.
Well, could I just start by saying, I think one thing that was missed in the RAND report that's critical to success, we talked about data and processes, but the most critical element is the people. And it's the people in the research organization and the people in what we call the manufacturer, which is really a research organization, but we call it the manufacturer. And one of the things that Justin pointed out in the report is that you need the clinicians who understand how the procedure is done, how the data is recorded in the electronic health records or the claims data. And then we need data scientists. And data scientists covers this broad umbrella of skills. And I think within that, I'd like to just roll back one layer of the onion on that, because I think the skills that you need in that are people who can design studies methodologically, who have decades of experience in design, and that tends to be epidemiologists. They can be physician epidemiologists or PhD epidemiologists, but it tends to be epidemiologists. Then you need people who can speak to the FDA statisticians in terms of hypothesis testing, if it's going to be anything that needs FDA approval. And so you need a really good biostatistician or a set of biostatisticians. And then you need the data extracted. So you need good people who really understand the data extraction. And then you need bioinformaticists who, like at the research organizations, who can design the NLP, who can understand the codes and where the data is housed. So I think you need those four elements under that umbrella of data scientists. So just wanted to, before we get into, want to bring us back to the question on how do we get at specific devices, but I just wanted to put that note in before we go down that road.
I'd like to echo that, Paul, and I think that's a very important aspect of our work. And this is kind of the difference between user perspective versus builder perspective. The users usually look for, where's the data, what can I apply, what study I can do. The builders are always asking, who are the people? How do I build a partnership? For most of the valuable data, let's think about most valuable data has a history and key stakeholders, people behind it. So building partnership with these folks and be able to then leverage that data is important builder perspective, right? So I think that decade of experience that many folks within the network have is a great resource to leverage and be able to approach to the data owners and then sort of think about what and how we can design those investigations. So I think what I'm highlighting, a step even before that, Paul, is leveraging our history and partnerships with many important data owners. And I'm not talking about just Medicare data that you can purchase. I'm talking about registry data, many health system data sets, integrated delivery organizations like Kaiser and others.
The other skill set I think that's very important is regulatory, both regulatory policy and regulatory interaction, because oftentimes it's phrasing the research question, communicating with FDA, understanding the backdrop of the policy is really important for success.
So Sandy, I think one of the things that you brought up is that as these areas further develop, there'll certainly be a lot of value that's created over time if we start using systematic approaches. UDI is one great example of that. It's interesting to me that we have more information about the cars we park in the car garages next to our healthcare systems compared to what we often have within our healthcare systems for the devices that go out the door. So I think there is an important aspect here that does bring value to healthcare systems, as we all are interested in greater understanding of population health, doing the right things for the right patients at the right time, and how we do so has intrinsic value there. Likewise, for the whole ecosystem, that's an important aspect here. The other thing, I think along those lines, again, the underlying foundation, I think what you heard here is all agree that, great studies start with, great designs and great people for it. Kind of continue my analogy. I mean, Jacques Cousteau, he got a lot of fame, but it wasn't just him. He had a lot of people in those boats.
I would just add, I feel like in all of the test cases I've participated in so far, not all of which are complete, there's been just a tremendous learning curve. And just because we're so much at the infancy, and I'm sure, and Justin and his team's report really did reflect this, a lot of the work that needs to be done in the beginning was work that we probably won't have to do the second time around. But in the beginning, we had to figure out where was the UDI, how do we pull it in, how do we merge it into the electronic health record, how do we unify those records and put them on a common data model that other systems are using so that we can do this kind of distributed data analysis, right? A lot of our systems aren't yet running at 100% to do this type of work. So it's going to take time, and it takes understanding, and it means talking to people, like, as Paul said, around builders, right? I've spent more time talking to the purchasing people at my hospital who I had never met before NEST, right? Which is just shows you the kind of steps you have to take, because they don't do medical device research. They don't really do any kind of research, but they buy stuff, and they have to keep track of inventory. And those are the sort of the strange connections that create bedfellows for this type of work.
Great, thanks. Thanks so much. Paul, were you going to say one more comment before I moved on?
Yeah, I was just going to, say what Joe just said, which is that supply chain, the UDI is in the supply chain information. So how you get at the supply chain information is the key. In some systems like Mercy, they've combined the supply chain with the EHR for product efficiency. And I think that's where things will go, because it's so much more efficient for the hospital in terms of just-in-time ordering and cost containment to understand exactly what devices they're using. Kind of like in any department store, everything's scanned. So I think hospitals will move there, because of the advantages on the supply chain side. But for research purposes, we had to go back to the supply chain, and as Joe said, that created meeting people that we hadn't really connected with. But that's what those connections need to happen.
So we have a lot of audience questions related to device identification, which I'm going to weave in before I switch topics, as we knew I probably shouldn't have made that the first topic, because we could make a whole session on device identification. But there are some questions of, do we know healthcare providers that have EHR data linked to identified medical devices? And I think, Paul, you did mention, for example, network collaborators. I wasn't going to name names that aren't here, but we do have network collaborators that have done that and have already incorporated in their flow, in their clinical flow, and how they capture that data, identifiable devices too. And as we know, UDI is invaluable for patient safety, and somebody commented on Adrian's comments too. So thanks for that. Not sure we can inform using UDI on claims, and I think that's beyond the scope of our NEST's capabilities and charge, but certainly if there was a way to be able to identify that, there would be. Moving back to some of the comments that Justin made in his observations that he presented too, is talking about the practice patterns at sites, and how that referral patterns and follow-up can impact the data and what we have, and the missingness and the completeness. So what are some potential solutions from this group's perspective, and are there potential areas where NEST could play a role from your perspective?
Maybe I can answer just quickly. Sandy, within NEST's network, like partnership that you guys are building, we have tremendous capacity already for doing a lot of data linkages. And I'm highlighting the experience that many groups, I mean, at least two groups have within network collaborators to do data linkages. For example, registries with claims, EHRs with claims. These are some really key ways for us to obtain better follow-up. And the experience we're accumulating in using claims data to define outcomes of interest and validate them is also quite well captured by Justin when you talked about phenotypes and creating a library of outcome events or certain predictors of outcomes, and developing and maintaining these algorithms within changing environment of new CPT codes are created, new ICD-10 codes are created, is certainly crucial. And I also want to highlight that that doesn't happen in a universal fashion like it happens for drugs, because the outcome events that we're dealing with are very heterogeneous. From clinical area to clinical area, we're dealing with very different events. Just within vascular device space, from carotid interventions, stents, or endovascular repair of aorta, or thoracic aneurysms, or peripheral vascular disease, within each of these subsections of vascular interventions, there are like at least a dozen outcome events that require continuous algorithm development and validation. And what I'm highlighting is that experience exists within the network already. I think it's possible to leverage today for designing really good real-world investigations, including pretty good data linkages with very good success rates, sometimes over 95% linkage we are able to achieve in specific clinical areas. And I'm sure Adrian has done many of this within DCRI. DCRI has been a champion for many years for cardiac space. Within the MD-EpiNet and CRNs, we champions the vascular linkages with Vision Initiative, hernia. I know, Joe, you've been doing many years the ICD and registry and linkages with CMS contract. I think this is like tremendous capacity. What I'm also highlighting is that we don't need a third party to come do data linkages for us. That's not what we're recommending when we're saying we need data linkages. We have that capacity internally already to leverage. And the same goes for analytics. I mean, sometimes we, as academic and scientists, want to highlight like the analytics of these linked data. We're not saying we need a third party to come analyze for us, okay? We're just highlighting that, look, this capacity exists and you guys can leverage.
This is Joe. I'll just jump in, Sandy, if that's okay. I mean, because this is definitely a challenge for our health system. So for instance, in the test case where we worked on with Paul, identifying patients who had underwent procedures with a specific ablation catheter, you know, we probably a third of our patients weren't seen after their sort of initial specialty care or outside of that specialty care follow-up, because Yale is a referral center that takes care of patients for a large area of the sort of Connecticut, New England area. They come to our health system for care and then leave. So this is a major issue for, you know, this type of real world evidence research that's not claims based, but instead it's health systems based. It is tricky thinking about ways to do these linkages, and obviously with registries we've gotten past it by not linking the entire registry, but linking the portions of the registry that's covered, you know, for Medicare beneficiaries, where there is that kind of universal claims data. And, you know, those solutions took a while to develop, and I'm, you know, obviously we're looking forward to developing those types of solutions for our work too, because there's great potential to it. But that also, you know, explains why we're doing some of the work on the pragmatic clinical trial side, which is the kind of inverse of, you know, identifying people through the health system, because we're following those patients through a trial at the point of care, but linking their electronic health record from multiple sources into one unit. That does allow us to follow them forward, even if they leave our health system. So we're testing different approaches and we're going to figure out what works best and ways to continue to sort of put our efforts.
Yeah, and from my perspective, which is a little biased, but I think part of the beauty of NEST is being able to link the different sources of data to get that complete picture of the patient and fill in where there might be gaps in the EHR data. And what we might have in the EHR data at one network collaborator, they might be a tertiary or quaternary center, but if we have another network collaborator where the same patient is seen, for example, just for primary care follow-up, how do we combine those and how do we use the claims data and registries? Registries are a great source of information. This kind of segues nicely into one of the questions that we have here on patient-reported outcomes and patient-reported outcome measures, right? And I know, Joe, you and Art both participated in several of our test cases that focused just on that patient-generated health data. So the question is, as we're thinking globally, how do we validate these by languages more efficiently and to make sure that we're including diverse populations in research, because this is an opportunity, right? And it's also, patient-reported outcomes was flagged as a priority too in MDUFA. So let me pause there.
Well, having done quite a bit of work in validating PROMs into different languages on the pharma side, there is a well-established process for that. CLD within CEDAR has established guidance on that, and there are very good vendors who can help with that. It's effort and it's time and it's resources, but there is a well-established process for validating PROMs into different languages. I think the other part of the question there was could we capture PROMs in EHR data more consistently? And there are PROMs captured in EHR data, particularly say for orthopedics, and but it tends to be captured consistently on the first month after the procedure, but not consistently over 1 or 2 years, which is when we really need the PROMs to look at the long-term outcomes. And oftentimes, like we looked at one healthcare provider and they only had 11% of patients had PROMs. You never know whether those patients who got the PROMs had some problem and therefore they were given the PROMs or were doing better. So there may be some bias in who's getting the PROMs. So I think figuring out ways to include PROMs more consistently in healthcare system electronic health records and clinical follow-up would be great. Or as Joe referred to, developing digital tools that can sit outside of the EHR, push that out to patients independent of their clinical visit, and then link that to tools like Hugo and others that are DCRI is developing an approach like that. So there may be approaches that using digital tools to collect the PROMs at consistent time intervals for each patient.
I see Adrian's hand up and then Art's, although you should have just jumped in. Don't raise your hand, just jump in.
I got to raise my hand on this because so I'm totally up for collecting better health status information for patients. What I'm not up for is burdening clinicians more because later this afternoon, this evening, I'll have hours of electronic health records to peck away at. And so but I do worry about the completeness of PROMs, and so there has to be better incentives for routine collection using direct-to-patient methods. So the technology is potentially available. The incentive structure has to change, and so there are examples, say in mental health, where this can be considered, where if you don't do it, you get the worst score. And so then that creates a natural incentive. However, there has to be some rewards for health systems to do it and integrate it into their practice through payment or reimbursement policies so that there's, again, shared value for doing so. So I'm all for it. I just want to make sure we don't burden the clinicians.
And that was actually a question of how do we improve that? So great. Art.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I just wanted to say that it's really unrealistic for us to hope that for every patient, we're going to get these PROMs into EHRs. I mean, let's be realistic. As Adrian says, I mean, this burden is very high on clinicians. Yes, even with good technologies, like we have Hive tools for collaborative data collection, including PRO data, so with physician and patient interaction, or directly like Hugo, which involves patients sort of independently doing that. I think these mechanisms are in place, but the efficiency and using this in a seamless fashion is still going to happen on study-by-study basis. So quickly able to launch the tools that we developed for NEST, Sandy, I think is a priority area. We have those tools, they're very secure. Their patients have a fantastic control over who they can share with and what they can do, like all the permissioning layers are in place. It can be applied to any registry, can be applied to any health system, free of charge, you know, in terms of implementation. But maintenance, of course, will have some costs. But I think this offering these solutions as a mainstream and offering this to partners, stakeholders, manufacturers who want to do those studies can be very much priority area, I think, for NEST.
I agree, Art. Thank you. Okay, I think we have time for one last question, and there's been just an outpouring of questions, and I'm sorry we're not able to get to all of them. I tried to group a whole bunch of them together. But this question centers around looking at medical device performance based on what they've been approved for by the FDA, and identifying kind of non-compliant use or I'll make the jump and say off-label use, and those results, as well as there was a question to be able to track on-label versus off-label use, right? And so our pilots, I'll start this, but our pilots were really focused on 3 specific areas. We were looking for something specific, either how do we do a specific label expansion that we're looking for, therefore pulling that off-label use for label expansion, or looking at a new approval or clearance or improved malfunction reporting. In our active surveillance system too, that's being built, I think we'll address some of this off-label issue and identifying what's being used off-label and the safety associated with that. But let me pause too and hear what the panelists' thoughts are on those questions.
I think it can be done, but it's not a push button. So, for example, in the test case that Joe and I collaborated on with Joe Drozda and Nilesh Shah and Sanket Dhruva and Shumin Jung, we looked at we were looking at comparing looking at a particular aspect of atrial fibrillation, persistent atrial fibrillation, rather than early stage atrial fibrillation. So we had to validate the codes that and come up with a computable algorithm to identify persistent atrial fibrillation patients reliably. So it took quite a bit of work, and we had to do some chart review to kind of make sure we were being accurate, but we were able to do it.
Yeah, I'll just note it's very complicated when you're using data like this. So we have a long way to go, but we're starting to make good inroads, just because it's not a clinical trial where the inclusion and exclusion criteria are just so explicit, and that leads to your FDA label. You're trying to sort of back out sort of what the clinician is doing in practice, which is just invariably messier. So we can all blame Adrian because he's doing it right now.
Okay, and we are at the top of the hour, but I just want to give 30 seconds for any final thoughts before I officially close out.
Yes, Sandy, I just want to close with a big thanks, both Justin's report and just the sort of support of NEST. I mean, I've been trying to do and working with FDA and ART and the MD crew doing medical device research for years, and I just feel like NEST has really kind of launched an enterprise of investigators across systems who are now working on these topics, which it's going to take a while for us to show the fruits of that labor, but it's coming, and I really just appreciate it.
Also wanted to thank Sandy and NEST for all of the great work, and for FDA for sponsoring it. I think a public-private partnership to sponsor RWE is critical for success, and also Justin for the great report. I think for next steps, just in 10 seconds, I would do an RFP in 4 areas: feasibility, including sample size. How do you get the information in the procedure, like UDI and surgical information, patient type? How do you get longitudinal follow-up? And then how do you work on integrating data from different data systems in distributed systems such as CDM and integrated and distributed analyses, that some of the methodology in integrating those. So 4 areas, and I would put out specific RFPs in those areas, or whichever areas you would identify. So, because the test cases were good to identify where there was problems, so now we need to go to specific focuses. Thanks.
Just final thoughts from me. I think this process would be incomplete if we don't have FDA in the room and be more accepting of the real world evidence and the type of studies that we're doing, putting the best efforts we can. If this feedback and collaboratively defining the threshold for evidence to pass the regulatory requirements is not in place, we'll be wasting a lot of time. So one key message I think for NEST and for FDA is, when we come up with really good study designs that are possible, fit for purpose, using real world evidence, I hope there will be an understanding that this is something that is the best possible using real world evidence. And short of doing massive, very expensive clinical trials, no other evidence will be available. So these are type of situations that I hope NEST will also address with FDA.
And Adrian, 10 seconds as our chair of our governing committee, last but not least.
Upward and onward. Let's keep going. We have a lot to do.
Awesome. We do have a lot to do, and I want to thank the panelists. Justin, thank you so much for presenting the interim RAND report. As a reminder, we will have a final report in September, and hopefully another webinar like this. We ran out of time, lots of engagement, lots of questions from our audience. So thank you to everybody and our stakeholders for attending, and this recording will be available soon. So with that, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.